There we go. Hello, I'm Faraz Hoodbhoy. I run innovation outreach at AT&T. I'm part of something called the AT&T Foundry, which is AT&T's innovation center. And my team and I act as the front door for new technology, bringing it into AT&T. And we've actually got a really interesting model because we've got a team of about 80 engineers who play with new technology all day long, specifically focused on really big business problems, and try to find solutions, places within AT&T where we can actually bring these technologies to market. We have a team in Israel as well, which is one of the ways that we stay in touch with the market, with the larger ecosystem out here. And we see close to about 500 companies a year. We end up doing deals with about 100 of them. So we have probably one of the most prolific deal-making environments and structures out in industry, and we're really, really proud of that. So what I wanted to do was talk to you a little bit about the infrastructure opportunities as we see them around virtual reality and augmented reality. And you know, you haven't really heard much from the telecom space or from the traditional infrastructure providers like us around VR and AR because we've been quietly trying to figure out what the heck is it and what does it mean for us and what is our play within the space. So we spent a lot of time looking at what other folks are doing. And so we realized, of course, the obvious stuff. Everybody's talking about it. We know that Tim Cook thinks it's going to be perhaps potentially as big as a smartphone. We know that Zuckerberg thinks that it's going to be one of the biggest things that they've invested in. And you know, we've talked about the investment that they made with Oculus. Satya Nadella over at Microsoft has really become a very powerful advocate for AR and VR, especially if you've seen the HoloLens. If you haven't, I encourage all of you to try it out. It's really a remarkably mature piece of technology for their first cut version. But he sees a world where every facet of life is going to be touched by AR. So clearly we're getting to a point where everybody starts to see the market's going to be big. Yes, we know that. The consensus is everybody's saying there's going to be money in it. Now the reality is, what is it that is actually kind of hampering or holding the market back is going to be the infrastructure that makes it available or not. And so the impact of that infrastructure being available or not has an impact on a low end. We see that, or Goldman actually came back and said that the VR AR market will be by 2025 on the low end around 33 billion and on the high end around 174. What's the number one basis for accelerated uptake or not is going to be the availability of infrastructure around having networks that can actually support these experiences. And so we spent a lot of time in trying to understand what does that mean. So we started by looking at a lot of the use cases. So rather than take the sort of build it and they'll come approach, we spent a lot of time trying to understand what is it that people are doing within VR and AR. And so these were the emergent use cases. Sorry for the font size. We'll try to make that bigger, but I'll read it out. So we're looking at the gaming space. We're looking at the video and entertainment space. We've been looking at the commerce space, training space, education, utility spaces, and the same spaces generally for AR as well as VR. And we realized that the technology requirements in both of these are somewhat similar in that you need to have a lot of compute power to be able to process very, very large amounts of information before you can start to make sense of, or make an experience that is actually compelling. So we sort of said, okay, what is it that is actually required to get AR and VR to a point where it can be adopted on a mainstream basis? And so we said, well, okay, here's some obvious ones. The endpoint display or the client devices need to get there. That means you've got to have the head-mounted displays, the glass, the ability to create high-resolution displays was an obvious one. But then the semiconductor industry also needs to get there, and they're not there yet. Now, whether you take CPUs or GPUs or use FPGAs, doesn't matter. The point is that the compute that's available there has limitations, and we spent a lot of time working with silicon vendors to find out how much compute is required. We've actually got a slide up ahead that'll talk about the compute deficit that's there, but it's significant. And it's significant not just because of the compute capabilities, but also because of the power and heat dissipation capabilities. So trying to take a piece of silicon that can generate photorealistic holograms in a wearable form factor probably won't be there for at least another 5+ years. We realize that the infrastructure is going to be needed on the network side, being able to get ultra low latency, have very, very high bandwidth. Now, these are obvious things, but the latency part is perhaps not as intuitive, because now you've got to think about an experience where it's not a web page where you can wait a few hundred milliseconds and it's not going to make you nauseous. But when you're in real time looking at these images as you move left and right, if there is a lag, you will feel it, and you very quickly will experience that if you have tried any of the devices and experiences that are available out today. The developer tools and the ecosystem to make this possible has to get more mature. We're not there yet. The development frameworks, the runtime environments to create these experiences have to be able to take advantage of the end client devices, but also server components to be able to do multi-threading in a GPU world. That doesn't happen right now. You need to have a new class of distribution channels. This is, in some senses, perhaps the stuff that's obvious and easy to figure out. New ways to discover and purchase, consume content. Those are kind of obvious things that you're going to have in any place. You're going to need new content. You're going to need new games. You're going to have new ways of displaying and delivering professional experiences as well as amateur experiences. And you're going to have to worry about security and access control. You're going to have to worry about privacy filters. You're going to have to come up with a new class of social engagement standards of how do people interact with one another in virtual worlds. And so we said, what are the spaces that we're going to fit? And this doesn't highlight terribly well, but we said our places where we're going to add value is going to be in the networking side, in the distribution side, in the content side, and in the security and access places. Those are the places where we think we've got to play. So I was telling you about the compute deficit problem that we've got. So if you take two of the most common devices in the AR/VR space today, the Gear VR and the Oculus Rift running off of a high-end gaming PC, the display resolutions are in the order of 2K to 4K, and your refresh rates are anywhere between 60 hertz to 90 hertz. And your processing capabilities that you have on the devices today are anywhere around 500 gigaflops to 6 teraflops in the extreme cases. Turns out, none of those get to the point where you can start to create experiences where people aren't going to puke on a long-term basis, and where they're going to be able to really feel that the holograms that they're interacting with are real or not. In fact, that compute deficit is something like 20,000 times lower than what's available today. And so we said, wait a second, here's an opportunity for us to bring infrastructure that can support these large experiences by accelerating the market. And it's really about trying to create a much larger market in a much shorter time period. So what is that opportunity? The opportunity for us as infrastructure providers is really this. Work with lower-end handsets and display devices, add edge clouds and networks where you can actually bring the compute closer to where the end user is, and try and get high-end experiences in a place where you can offload the compute of rendering, something that's a fairly complicated process, and do that on a distributed basis. Now, that becomes a real interesting problem, because the minute you try to essentially take a high-end PC and blow it up over a distributed geographical basis, you introduce latency as a huge problem. So you've got to somehow bring that latency down to within a few milliseconds so that it is part of the round-trip loop in there. Turns out that's one of the biggest advantages that we have as infrastructure providers. If nothing else, we own a lot of physical real estate. So how many of you here have some form of broadband at home? Pretty much everyone. For those of you who have DSL, you've probably heard you have to be a certain distance away from the central office. Guess what? We've been around for 160 odd years. We've got physical real estate where every major population center is in the United States. That is one major advantage that we have, to be able to reuse that physical real estate to essentially create farms of high-end graphic processing, to be able to offload that and create an environment and an ecosystem where you can start to offload your compute into the edge, into the cloud. And that is where we see our biggest play happening. If we're able to make that happen right, we can accelerate that market, and that can have an impact for industry, for all of us, in the tune of at least tens and potentially hundreds of billions of dollars. So where is it that we've been going? Yes, we know it's big. we know that the technology requirements for AR and VR are still extraordinarily high. The compute deficit is significant. However, we're rolling out 5G and new networks, and here's the funny part. When you roll out a new network, you need to have new use cases. And it turns out we think very strongly that this is one of the best use cases that highlights the value of 5G, which is very high bandwidth with very, very low latency. So at the end of the day, we think we've been learning a couple of new tricks. So we're really happy to be here, and we would love to work with new companies as they're coming out. As you guys come up with new technologies, please bring them to us. We'll try to take it out at scale. Thanks.